paid good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
In an amazing castle with a tickle-em-to-death torture chamber and a 500-player piano with 480,000 keys. It's a musical merry-go-round sparkling with songs and dances, whirling you away to a new world of wonders.
Have a smoke. Have a cigar.
Don't mind if I do.
Something to eat. Something to drink.
Dr. T is sweet on Mrs. C. So is Mr. Z, the plumber, who fixes sinks and knows all the angles.
When the plumber Zabladowski has installed the last sink, I want him disintegrated. Atom by atom.
See the dangerous descent from the sky-high ladder. See the whammy duel between Dr. T and Mr. Z. See the eighth wonder of the cinema world, the startling, daring Wonderama in color by Technicolor.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. David MacGregor.
Happy to be here.
Also joining us for the first time is Mr. John Monaghan.
Thanks for inviting me.
On this special episode, we are looking at the 1953 film The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, produced by Stanley Kramer, directed by Roy Rowland, and written by Dr. Seuss. The film stars Hans Conreid as the titular Dr. T, that's short for Terwilliker, as in the famous Terwilliker Method for happy fingers of child pianists everywhere. The film also stars Tommy Rettig as Bartholomew Collins, not Cubbins, an ungrateful little kid who wants to ruin Dr. T's grand plans. Damn that little pipsqueak. We'll be talking about those plans and more as we discuss the film, so if you don't want anything ruined, turn off the podcast and come back after you've seen the film. You will be glad that you did. So, David, when was the first time you remember seeing this film, and what did you think?
I cannot remember specifically when I saw this film. Obviously, I didn't see it when it came out, but I do remember vividly watching it with just this growing sense of disbelief. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, and I didn't know where it was going to go next. I thought the imagery was fantastic. It was Hieronymus Bosch meets Salvador Dali meets Triumph of the Will, and I really enjoyed it. It's one of those films that when I saw it, I wanted to watch it again. In my film viewing experience, it was like Blade Runner or Pig in the City.
Right up there at the top.
Yep.
And John, how about yourself? When was the first time you saw it, and what did you think?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but I knew I saw it as a kid. It was just one of those movies I stumbled on. I was movie crazy since I was about age 10. And it just seemed so different from other musicals or children's fantasies that I had seen. And it really spoke to me, just the weirdness of it. And I really liked Dr. Seuss at the time and still do. And doing the research, I realized that this comes out around the same time as probably my favorite Dr. Seuss book, which is Scrambled Egg Super. So I just think it has just the idea of a live action Seuss movie. We've had them since, but it was pretty much an oddity for about 50 years there before they made those god-awful movies with Mike Myers and Jim Carrey.
Yeah, those movies are pretty traumatizing, but this movie traumatized me. I didn't remember that I had seen it for a long time, and then I was watching it. I think it was because David was writing a piece for me for Cashiers to Cinemark back in the old days. And as I was rewatching it, I was like, it came to the scene of the guy who's in the drum. I remembered that. And I was just like, that's a horrible torture. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, I've seen this movie. That was the moment. And it had just burned itself in my brain so much. Nothing else, which is surprising. But that idea of a man being trapped inside of a drum that's being beaten forever and he will never be able to escape, that was pretty traumatic to me. And now watching it again, going to the Motor City Cinema Society screening that was held recently and being able to look at it and talk about it there, doing the research for this was just fascinating. And just to see or to think about what this movie could have been, what's there now is pretty fantastic, but what could have been, holy cow. So I'm excited to talk about that with you guys after we talk a little bit more about this fantastic movie.
I think you're right. From a child's perspective, this could be a very traumatic watch. There is some really disturbing imagery in it. And kids respond to movies much more primally than adults. They don't just watch films, they live and breathe them. And you can critique my parenting skills, but when my son was little, he was watching Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And when he watched Alexander Nevsky, he was dripping with sweat from reenacting the knights fighting on the ice scene. And when I was a little kid, the two films that really freaked me out, one very cliche-ish is The Flying Monkeys, Wizard of Oz. That was terrifying. And then for some reason, I don't know how this happened, I had the TV on, and the movie was House of Wax with Vincent Price, and that scene where this woman starts beating on his face and his face breaks. I was like almost ill. I was like, holy, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I think this film has a lot of scenes like that as well that are very powerful, visceral scenes.
Well, it's funny when you talk about how kids respond. Mike can back me up on this because I run films in a group called the Motor City Cinema Society. We show movies on Mondays in 16 millimeter. And there was one kid in the audience, his parents had brought him. They probably liked the film. And Mike, you were sitting closer to him than I was, but he just wasn't having it. What was the quote? Do I have to watch any more of this? And
I think he just says, I don't want to see this anymore.
And what has that impact on a lot of kids? My kids, I showed them some pretty odd stuff as young kids. And yeah, they didn't respond to this certainly like I did. And I found that with anybody I've recommended this movie to, either they really like it or they're like, what? And I think it's that kind of movie. I think it's polarizing.
We've talked about these kind of traumatic kid movies before, like Secret of Nim or The Dark Crystal, where you're asking yourself, who is this for? Because there's a lot of different things going on in here. You've got the whole story of little Bart, who I know, by the way, before this recording is over, I will probably call him Tommy or Timmy quite a few times, especially Timmy, because he was the original, as far as I know, Timmy from Lassie. So I might call him Timmy. So please, I apologize if that happens. But little Bart with his whole, I don't want to play piano. And so you've got that angle for kids where it's just like, yeah, I understand this whole thing. You don't want to take these lessons. This is awful. You don't like your piano teacher. Your piano teacher has got your mother in his back pocket so much that it's almost like he's got her hypnotized. You've got that whole story going on. But then there's everything with Dr. Terwilliker and this whole World War II parable that's happening at the same time. And so you're sitting here watching this going, wait, who is this for? And why is this movie so dark? And yeah, kids like darkness sometimes, I think. I know I was a big fan of those aforementioned films, but yeah, this one, it just wasn't around that much. And so it is interesting how people connect with it or they don't.
Well, I think it harkens back a little bit to the original fairy tales of the Grimm brothers, that they're not nice. They are terrifyingly horrific. They involve evil witches putting red hot shoes on their feet and dancing till they die, and cannibalism, witches that enjoy roasting small children and eating them. And those are fairy tales, ostensibly for children. And this is ostensibly for children as well, but it has a really dark edge to it.
As does the Dr. Seuss books, right? There's a dark edge to a lot of those too. So it's not surprising he has such a hand in it. And I know you've done a lot of research, Mike. I'd like to hear more what you found about exactly what his role was in this film. What was he, was he signing off on the designs on the film? Do you know much about that?
I think he must have, because there's an early draft of the script where a few times in it he says, or yeah, I imagine it's him, because he's the sole credited writer on the early draft from September 26, 1951. When we saw your print of it, I swore that the Roman numerals at the beginning said 1952, but it's always credited as a 1950 1953 film. I don't know if there was just a delay because of the re-edit to it, but this revised second draft is what I'm referring to now. That has a few places where he says, refer to sketch. And it feels like he probably storyboarded quite a few pieces of this or would draw out the designs, because so much of the look of this movie, especially when you look at some of the paintings that they use in order to make the sets seem even bigger than they are. And there are some huge sets in here, but sometimes where they're using paintings to extend stuff, those designs, especially, I guess you would call them gargoyles, those things are right out of his drawings. He has such a distinct drawing style, and you just see that in all of the designs of these things. It really looks like he had a major hand in this. Of course, there are credited production designers, set designers, but it feels like they were really going after his very particular style.
Mm-hmm. Hey, you mentioned the year 1953. And when I think 53, I think 3D. And whenever I watch Dr. T, I always think, what if this had been a 3D movie? Wouldn't it have been even better?
Well, I think that particular year, 1953, part of the impact of this film, and partly because this bombed big time, it failed. I don't know about you, John. There's a documentary on Robert Crumb just called Crumb, in which he talks about growing up in the 1950s and talks about how safe and sanitized the culture was. And it was Pat Boone and Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, and coming out of World War II and the atomic bomb and the communist threat, that middle America wanted this incredibly safe and sanitized culture. And it was only on the fringes that you had the beginning of Lenny Bruce and clubs, or you had the art of John Willie or Eric Stanton. And then you had this film that were clearly way out of bounds of the comfort level of, middle America at that time.
You're talking about 3D, and then we're also talking about a movie that is completely set inside of a child's imagination. There's only 2 scenes in this movie that might not be him dreaming. I'm assuming that he's not dreaming in those 2 scenes. Otherwise, everything's a dream. And that is so similar to another 1953 film, Robot Monster, that we just talked about on Sci-Fi July. And that whole movie, 3D. So yeah, it was definitely in the air, if not in the bubbles. And then also this whole idea of it being a child's fantasy. And I know even when we were talking about Robot Monster, people are comparing it to Invaders from Mars. And I think the opening shots of 5,000 Fingers with the big ball that are the balls and the almost saucer shape and things, people are like, oh, that's very similar to Invaders from Mars as well. But yeah, it was fascinating to me that there are 2, I don't want to say that Robot Monster was a major film, but 2 very notable from 1953 that are all inside of this, a child's imagination, and everything is reinterpreting things from the real world, quote unquote, into his fantasy. Even things like the pictures of his uncles that are on the piano, and that becomes a major part of the movie.
Yeah, I like that. And I don't know how you guys feel about framing stories when they are well done, like here, Wizard of Oz, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I really like the efforts that are made to connect the dream world with the real world that the protagonist has just drifted out of. I love the creativity involved in that, the connection between those completely, seemingly disparate worlds, but there's these little tendrils of connection between them. And as a filmmaker, that's got to be a lot of fun to come up with those little hints and cues for the audience.
It was interesting for me too to read this earlier draft of the script and see some of the things that are there either in songs or they come up in dialogue. Like at one point, Mr. Zabludowski, and we'll talk about him in just a second, but he starts talking about, like, oh yeah, I remember the Scout's Oath. And he starts to do the whole Scout's Oath. That's interesting because that comes up in the next version of the script. I think Alan Scott really deserves a lot of credit for probably shaping a lot of this stuff. But to have that be the oath that Bart has Mr. Zabludowski take, and they have that whole blood pact, which is the one thing that comes out of the dream. That's one of the few times that I think, and by the way, I just looked it up, Invaders from Mars, also 1953. So how strange is that? But to have, like when Dorothy wakes up at the end, there's no remnants. She doesn't have the ruby slippers on anymore. She doesn't have the witch's broomstick or anything. So this is very odd that when he comes out of the dream world, it's like, how much of that was a dream? Because they both have bandages on their fingers.
Yeah, that's true. For Dorothy, all the farmhands surrounding the bed, like she says, you were there and you were there. That's the connection between Kansas and Oz. Yeah.
Yeah, and here you've got Mr. Zawodowski and as well as his mom there and Mr. Terwilliker, and then the uncles that we only see in those photos. We get to see them in real life. So we should probably talk a little too. The beginning of this movie actually was not supposed to be the beginning of this movie. The whole thing with the butterfly nets and these guys who are all dressed in green. I mean, when you first see this Bart in his little beanie and he's creeping through this very surrealistic landscape, and there's a person on one of these big spheres that they have, and he has a spotlight on his head, like part of his head is a spotlight, and he's dressed all in green. And I'm just like, this is almost like a prototype for the Grinch with the way that all of these guys are dressed in pure green and the way they chase after him with these massive butterfly nets, all of different colors. Very striking. And that whole part of this was actually supposed to be more in the film. It was supposed to start in the real world rather than starting with the dream sequence, coming out of it and then going back into it. I'm not complaining about the way that they had that set up. I just thought it was interesting that they're like, no, we got to move this closer. And we also, I believe that they reshot the opening to include Dr. Terwilliker there, because I think he shows up. If he just shows up in the dream world, is this guy even real? We see photos of him, but that's as close as we get, other than they added that appearance of him at the beginning.
I'm sure you, Mike, you're the maven. So you tell me, because I've read that the original script was 1,200 pages long. And it's, as someone who's written a screenplay or two, it's okay, that's 10 times longer than a screenplay. And I know original cut was ostensibly a little over 2 hours and they hacked that down. But for 1,200 pages, I can't imagine what they would have had in that.
It seems very apocryphal.
It could be. Yeah.
I don't know where he would have gone with that, because I didn't read a 1,200 page draft. I'd probably still be reading that today if I had started that. But the one from 51 is 108 pages. It's definitely a lot looser than the next script and then the eventual film. I want to say the next one was from 1952. So with that one, it's a lot tighter. He also has all the songs in there. So that starts to really firm up how things are. But yeah, I can't imagine a 1,200 page draft. And really, even when you add back in all the songs, I'm sure there's some dialogue around the songs. So yeah, I guess a little over 2 hours does seem right, but it just seems like they would have not planned for it to be an epic at that time. It feels like a tight 90 is what they should have been aiming for in the first place.
When I saw that, I thought sometimes writers, they go off. There's a story about Philip K. Dick having a 5-second vision of God and sitting down and writing an 8,000 page book based on those 5 seconds. And so it's not beyond the realm of possibility when writers are incredibly inspired and they just go. You never know. The first draft could be way, way longer than it should be, but it just seemed a little excessive to me.
Oh, yeah. That second draft, revised final draft, is this one credited to Alan Scott and Dr. Seuss, February 25th, 1952. So about 5 months later, I guess that was. And yeah, this one is, I think, what they ended up shooting. You can see like things. It was interesting in the earlier draft, things like the line about the King of Persia. You know what he does? He stays in Persia. And in the earlier draft, it's the King of Sweden doesn't step on my heels. He stays in Stockholm. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know why they felt that they needed to change Sweden to Persia, but okay, whatever. I just was like, of all the changes, some of these are arbitrary.
Yeah, but writers are arbitrary. Like that line, this sounds good. And I will say as an aside that visuals, story aside, I think there's just some great lines in this film. And I when I first see him, when I heard him, I'm like, yeah, that's a good line. Man, I wish I wrote that. Yeah, that's clever. I appreciate good dialogue. And there's some really terrific, what makes good dialogue to me is A, it's human, but B, it's perfectly suited for the occasion and the situation. And it doesn't sound scripted. it sounds real. And I think there's a lot of instances in this film that you get to see that.
I wanted to talk a little bit about its origins and the whole Stanley Kramer thing behind it. It's like such an unusual film for him. We think of him with those kind of message type movies, the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner type stuff. And this is just such an odd picture for him. It's the same year he made The Wild One too, which isn't a real Stanley Kramer kind of movie. And I shared with you guys that picture that I swear I thought I had dreamed this picture. It's a picture of Marlon Brando with a couple of women wearing Dr. T beanies with the little hands on top as a cross-promotional photograph. And it's one of my favorite pictures ever, but I only recently found it again online because it's just such an unusual pairing. But yeah, Stanley Kramer was making a ton of movies back then for Columbia. And again, this is definitely one of the odder ones.
And yeah, when I first saw the film, I would not have associated it with Stanley Kramer at all. But subsequently, if you think about it, this is a message film. Stanley Kramer, yeah, you're absolutely right. Judgment in Nuremberg, fascism, Ship of Fools, High Noon, the Caine Mutiny, etc. There's a lot of message, progressive thought in his pictures. And it's here because he is mocking, as far as can be mocked, the whole pretense of leaders that dress up and the regular people that fall in line behind them, like August Zabladowski, and the triumph of the will aspects of this film with the scenery and the marching guards and the goose stepping. And he's making a mockery of it all and just showing you this is how ridiculous these clowns like Hitler, like Mussolini, this is how they look. This is who they really are. They're ridiculous clowns that we should laugh at. So in that sense, it did fit in my view of a Stanley Kramer, we've got a message film.
I sometimes wonder if maybe this movie came out a little too late because this was 52, 53. We're a few years north of VE Day. But yeah, the metaphor of wartime and especially Hitler is just, it does not take very much at all to find that. And in that earlier draft, it's even more prominent. There are many times where Seuss calls Terwilliker Hitlerian. And then he even has Zabladowski, who for me, it feels almost like Zabladowski is America and he doesn't want to get involved. And there's this whole thing of just leave me alone. There's a song about I don't want to get involved is basically it.
For 20 million billion years, this earth it has revolved. Without my help, so let it spin, I will not get involved. Let the darn thing spin, let the darn thing spin, I will not get involved.
I'm an independent contract.
Early in the film, he says, why did Hitler want to conquer the world? Hitler's racket, and they talk about rackets and Terwilliker's racket. Hitler's racket was conquering countries. Terwilliker's racket is conquering fingers. Why? I wouldn't know. I'm no psychiatrist. I'm merely the neighborhood plumber. And yeah, you just, whatever. I'm just here to put in the sinks. And as long as these sinks get put in, we'll get the A-OK from the sanitation inspector. And then he can start his camp, basically. And this whole thing of, and I think you pointed this out originally to me, David, this thing of when all the little boys show up to the Happy Fingers Institute in order to play their piano. That scene is right out of like Schindler's List. This whole thing of these guards tearing open their suitcases and taking all their valuables out. And, you know, these poor kids, there's kids that are crying. There's that one incredibly unhappy kid that's at the piano and they just keep focusing on him towards the end of the film. That for me is just such a, okay, all the buses are here. Go in. It almost sounds like they're practically kidnapping these kids in the earlier draft of the script. She does, Mrs. Collins does have a thing where she's talking to women on the phone, to other mothers on the phone. I think that's still there in the final film where she's just like, no, we're not having this. We're not having any of these. No softballs, baseballs, or hockey pucks. And it's just like, yeah, don't bring those things. Just these kids are here to do their thing. Work will set them free.
I think Zabladowski as the plumber, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, and there's, we'll say it's apocryphal or whatever. Various people will say at various points that 20% of humanity are complete sociopaths that just want to destroy everything and everybody for their own profit. And 20% of humanity are the opposite of that. We're all in it together. They want to save the world, save each other. And then 60% of humanity is in the middle. And their attitude is, as long as it doesn't affect me, I don't give a rat's ass either way. And that's August Zabludowski. He is disinterested until you can say that in this film, Bart needs August Zabludowski to save him, but August Zabludowski needs Bart to save him. And I like that kind of connectivity, that association between them. It's a very interesting film in the sense that there's all kinds of statistics about step parents versus biological parents and the damage that they can inflict on children. And that's why historically, fairy tales, it's evil stepfathers, evil stepmothers. And Dr. Terwilliker is the epitome of the potentially evil stepfather. And it's August Zabludowski's job to become the good parent and save Bart from this horrible fate of having an evil stepfather.
Even though he's pretty easily duped the first time with a little bit of pickle juice, a little bit of pickle juice, and he's good to go.
Who hasn't been duped by pickle juice? Come on.
And then his poor mother, who's, I mentioned, it's almost like he's got her hypnotized. In the fantasy world, she's so hypnotized. And there's a whole song that, it's not really a major song, but there's a little musical act in there where Terwilliker is hypnotizing her. That gets cut out, but we get the theremin in that. What I really like about this movie, and I don't even know if we've talked about the music that much, but the musical motifs that we have, especially with Terwilliker and the theremin, or just that da, 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 and sometimes it's a triplet at the end, sometimes it's not, but just, okay, something's about to go down here with Terwilliker coming in, and I'm just like, then who's she? Who did Hitler have buffaloed so much that everybody else was just like, can't you see what he's doing? That's the little kids and the adults in the audience, myself included, are just like, wake up, Heloise. Don't you see that he's got you under his power? And I'm just like, what country was that? Was that Britain? Was that Neville Chamberlain? I'm not sure what that is, but I'm just like, it really feels like there's a metaphor going on here.
I think there definitely is. It's the appeal of a cult hero, cult leader, cult figure. And you might want to pretend otherwise, but if you watch old movies of Hitler driving through the streets, the German people are hysterical with joy. They love that boy. He's their guy. He may be a sociopathic piece of crap, but he's their sociopathic piece of crap. And we love that. And yeah, people go along dismayingly easily with evil as long as they think it's going to be directed at someone other than themselves.
Or that they're going to get some money out of it, some pastulas out of it.
Zabludowski does put up a good fight, and he knows how to counter with the magic and the hypnotism when that dance they do. But then again, he comes around to Terwilliker's way, and maybe he's hypnotized a bit by the beauty of Eloise too. But yeah, it is fun to watch his growth in the movie for sure.
She's the only female in the film. It's her. And that's an interesting call as a filmmaker, as a storyteller. I'm just going to have the one woman, easily swayed woman that will do what I tell her to do. Yeah. And that's why she's got to go in that lock me tight cage.
Yes. Once her dress is pretty schizophrenic, that it's both a business dress and an evening dress all in one, depending on which shoulder you look at, which I thought was a pretty clever idea.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, when we meet her, she is Mrs. Cleaver. High heels, apron, pearl earrings, as all women wear normally every day around the house. She's the epitome of the domesticated 1950s housewife.
You mean in the real world part?
Yes.
The opening?
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Bart's father is obviously out of the picture. Are you guys thinking maybe World War II, maybe Korean War? But it definitely feels like he is, obviously it's not a divorce, feels like he died at some point.
Yeah, this is early 1950s, and how old's the kid? How old do you think Bart is?
It feels like about 8, 10, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, but you never hear. Just no dad.
Yeah, this really becomes this Oedipal crisis for him, where he's just, I need a new father figure. And I don't want it to be Dr. Terwilliker. I want it to be August Zabladowski. That whole thing where he pretends to fish and they have that wonderful bonding moment where they're both pretending to fish, and that Zabladowski has to be like, no, this is going too far. Next thing I know, you're going to be sick and get the sniffles and I'm going to have to take care of you. I don't want anything to do with this whole fatherhood thing. It just wants to bow out. And that's yet another example of Zabladowski just flaking out. There are so many times where he's oh, I know the score. And then Bart comes in. He's just like, my mother, she's hypnotized. You have to go save her. And he goes up to basically to the tower of the castle to defeat the dragon, but the dragon defeats him, buffaloes him by offering him lit cigars on this almost like string/candelabra that he pulls out, or he's got all the different drinks that they have or the different food that he has. And I love how he like will hit a spot on the floor and this whole thing comes shooting up with all the different cakes. And of course, the way that Dr. Seuss writes this stuff, he really emphasizes the alliteration of things, but then he'll switch it and he'll go from all of these things, say, that start with the letter S, and then he'll just throw in something odd and then throw in something more odd than that, just with the way that he describes the drinks, with the way that he describes the food.
No, make yourself comfortable. Relax. Have a smoke. Have a cigar.
I don't mind if I do.
Something to eat? Hot cakes, layer cakes, fish cakes, peanut brittle, the blue plate special, or chicken pot pie?
I don't mind if I do.
Something to drink? Schnapps, sake, Schlivovitz, Schweppes, tequila, turtle tears, or just plain cocoa?
I have no objection.
Oh, but wait. For such a distinguished guest, the pride of our cellars, vintage pickle juice.
And then there's two songs that really go all out when it comes to Seuss, because he starts to interject that nonsense language that only he can do so well. My favorite Seuss book growing up was On Beyond Zebra, which is all of the letters that are past Z in the alphabet, and he exposes what those are, plus what they stand for. So Z for zebra, then this letter stands for this animal, and he'll give this whole history. The word that always comes back to me is snood. Like he uses snood in this movie. He uses snood in his books, and it's just, what is a snood? It's a MacGuffin that has no meaning, but he sure does use it a lot.
Yeah, I really appreciate his use of language. When I started reading more literature than Dr. Seuss, I realized he was in the vein of Charles Dickens in terms of character names. Ebenezer Scrooge, the Grinch. They have such great names for their characters, really inventive names that are obviously so well suited and so popular, they have lapsed into common vernacular. Now you know what a Scrooge is, you know what a Grinch is. They just made those up. I think that's really compelling evidence of just how creative these guys were.
And I want to talk about the acting too. We've talked a little bit about some of the characters, but the actors that are actually portraying these folks. So you've got Zabladowski and Collins, Mrs. Collins, that is, played by Peter Lind Hayes and Mary Healy, who I didn't know. I must have not been paying attention during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to know that they were an act that they played, I think, at the Copa for a while, or one of the Vegas casinos. They were in movies together. They sang together. They both have very good voices, surprisingly so. When they start belting out stuff, it's, oh, who's singing this? Well, it's actually them. They have a whole series of records and all this. They wrote a autobiography together, but unfortunately, I think the cheapest I could find it was like $45, and I really could not bring myself to justify that. I wish there was a cheaper version of that available. I'd like to read them, but at the same time, I saw an interview with Hayes and Healy. They're both getting up there. He's got a full head of white hair. She's still looking pretty darn young, but he's like, when she's very entertaining and people keep asking her questions, especially the host of this program. And after a while, Hayes is just, he starts acting up like a child. And it's just, here, the attention needs to be on me. So let me do something silly or start to sing a song or do an impersonation. And it's, while you're watching him and you're just like, he's being a brat, a 70-year-old brat, but at the same time, it's like, oh, okay, I can see why this guy was pretty popular because he is very quick-witted, even at that age, and is able to just rattle off these stories and belt out a song like nobody's business.
And they had genuine chemistry in the picture. I love their scenes together. You can tell they're really comfortable around each other.
You make a good point. They're largely forgotten now. Most people have never heard of Mary Healy and Peter Hayes, but they were like the perfect American couple. They were a real life couple. She was Miss New Orleans. He served in the U.S. Army, in the Air Force, I should say, in World War II. They were married for 58 years. They adopted 2 children. They were on Broadway. I think they had 2 separate TV shows that were just about them. One in 1950, one in 1960. They were a singing team. They were like America's perfect couple.
They don't show up much in just pop culture, it doesn't seem.
And these days, they would just be seen as like ridiculously clean cut, too good to be true, almost. But yeah, they had one show was the Peter and Mary show in 1950, and then they had Peter Loves Mary in 1960. And yeah, that's not going to fly today. Everything's ironic. Everything sucks. So it doesn't really fit in with our current sensibility at all. But they were a big deal in their era. Radio, Broadway, film, they covered the spectrum. They were transmedia phenomenon before that term even existed.
Tommy Rettig, of course, had a career. You already mentioned Lassie, but he's in a favorite film noir. He's in The Window, just short of this, where he's another kid that sees something that nobody will believe. The adults don't believe. So it's a cool companion piece.
That is very frustrating for me. That trope of the kids that aren't believed. That's why I quit watching or reading the Lemony Snicket books, because it's just, guys, they are telling you what's going on with this Jim Carrey. Boy, another Jim Carrey reference. Jim Carrey character. Why aren't you listening to them? This whole movie could have been over in 5 minutes if you just listened to the kids. And I do like when Zabludowski's, I'm going to listen to everything that you say now, even your lies.
That's my second or third favorite line. I think my first one is when Bart plaintively begs to Zabludowski, "You're my only hope." And Zabludowski says, "I'll just give up hope right here and then." I mean, that's cold, baby. That is cold from the respective father figure. Yeah. It's just tangential, but you guys might remember this. There was a TV show called Quincy starring Jack Klugman. And my mom, God rest her soul, would watch that. And it was the same story every week. Something really bizarre happened, inexplicable. Quincy would say, "I think it's this." Everybody would go, "No." And in the end, "Oh my gosh, look at that. Quincy was right." And next week, gosh, it was the same thing. And she loved that show. God bless Jack Klugman too. But oh my God, that we don't believe the person telling the truth trope. I'm not a fan. I'm just not a fan.
Yeah. Almost the opposite, because he's not a kid. He's definitely upper in age. You don't believe them any more than you believe kids. It's empowering, though, isn't it, for Bart to be right through the whole thing? He sees through Terwilliker right away. He says he's a racketeer before we even meet him.
Yeah, and when we finally do get to see Terwilliker in the dream world, and you get that great low-angle shot of him on that piano, just so many wonderful shots of Hans Conreid. And Hans Conreid, I cannot say enough good things about him. I've gone and, John, you and I talked a few weeks ago, and I had already started to deep dive on Conreid. I've gone farther than that. I've watched even more of his stuff where he shows up, a few seconds here and there, like he's the magician who gets shot in Journey into Fear, or he's one of Dobie Gillis's professors, actually a pretty important professor, which is great in The Affairs of Dobie Gillis, which was, I want to say that was 1953, which was like a huge year for Hans Conreid because he had Affairs of Dobie Gillis. He was in a couple shorts and everything. 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is one of 2 starring roles. The other leading role that he has was the exact same year, which was The Twonky, which I don't know if you guys have ever seen The Twonky, but it is, pretty remarkable. Though I was reading a biography of Hans Conreid, and it sounds like Arch Oboler just was not directing that the way that he should have. He was not bringing his actors in and letting them know that it was a comedy.
which is pretty bad.
Yeah, I thought it was a great film, even though it sounds like it didn't come together as well as they wanted it to, but I thought it was fantastic. And then, of course, he was Captain Hook and Mr. Darling in Peter Pan that same year. And I wish that they had the footage because they would have him in costume. They had almost all the characters in costume acting things out. Like we've seen footage of, I can't remember the actress's name, who was in Alice in Wonderland, and we've seen her being animated over kind of thing. They had all that for Captain Hook and Peter Pan as well. And I've seen images of him dressed in his Captain Hook costume. Gosh, I wish I could see what that would have looked like, him just pretending to be Hook before they animated him.
I wonder if he thought of this film as being anything special in his career, because it is, to me, it's a high moment.
I think he was hoping this would launch him off into greater projects, but the fact that it bombed so badly, I think at one point he compared it to, there was a 1950s film called Wilson. It was a biography of Woodrow Wilson.
No boy.
Which did not do well at the box office.
Riveting.
Between that and this film, he pretty much was reduced to supporting or character roles. But he had actually met Seuss like 6 years earlier. He provided the narration for a film called Design for Death. It was a documentary. In fact, it won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1947 or 48. It used confiscated Japanese films. And Hans Conreid was one of the narrators in the film, and that's his first association with Seuss.
Do you think this film would have maybe done better with a different director who had more of a noticeable style? Because Roy Rowland, who had made some really good films, didn't really have his own kind of voice as a director. He's a workman-like director. He directed one of my favorite film noirs called 99 River Street, and he directed Our Vines Have Tender Grapes, this really surprisingly great performance really soft performance by Edward G. Robinson. But it's always odd when I see him attached to this picture.
I've read that he was basically hired because he'd done well with the kid movies. And there was some issue. The studio had an issue with Kramer directing the film himself. But I've also heard that Kramer did direct a lot of the scenes himself, and that Rowland had some kind of issue or had to step away from the set for a period of time, and that Kramer took over. The extent to which that's true or verifiable, I don't know.
And it's such a busy time in Kramer's life. He's making 3 or 4 films as a producer, I think, that year alone. Pretty crazy. But I didn't realize he had such a strong feeling for this particular project. That's really interesting.
Yeah, he definitely did. I know that he and Seuss were both unhappy with it. They blamed studio meddling and whatnot, as is typically the case. So they weren't happy with the final result, but he was all in initially, same as Seuss. They were fully committed to this, and it just didn't turn out the way they wanted. And obviously when it premiered, I don't know if you've read Hans Conreid's comments about the premiere. He literally said, maybe he's exaggerating, by the end of the film, only one little boy was left in the theater, and he's waiting for his mother to come pick him up. That's a grim way to open. It reminds me of, I like reading reviews of premieres of film and how people reacted. And it was a lot like one of the reviews for Eraserhead, that people could not start leaving the theater fast enough, like 10 minutes into the film. This had similar kind of reviews for the premiere.
So Columbia pretty much gave up on this picture, even though they tried to re-release it as under the title Crazy Music in a second release. Do you have a handle on how that all went down?
No, all I know is this was famous and not typical. I think that's one of the things I love about culture, is that the way time can have such a redemptive role in making us relook at things that when they came out, they were completely dismissed. And that goes for this film. It goes for films like Blade Runner. It goes for novels like Moby Dick, novels like Kate Chopin's The Awakening, that they were just, no, this is crap. Get it out of my sight. But then 70 years later, people are like, wow, this is pretty great. This is really cool.
Yeah, I guess we should be clear. It's not just the 3 of us that really love this picture. It's got some pretty high profile fans. I've been hearing about attempts to make a Broadway musical out of this thing for the last at least 20 years.
That cracked me up when I was watching those extras. The Indicator Blu-ray of this, by the way, for folks at home. If you enjoy this movie, it's a great transfer and the extras on it are great. I was so shocked when Michael Feinstein shows up, and I'm just like, what? He's a huge fan of the movie, and he shows up in one little documentary. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then he shows up in another one that's just dedicated to the music, and he just walks us through that. And of course, I can't stop thinking of the Gamera versus Giron episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, where Mike Nelson was playing Michael Feinstein and talking about the incredible intricacies of the Gamera theme song, which I just absolutely love. But there he is, just, oh yeah, I've been trying to get this staged. I found the original score. I've been trying to get somebody to play the ballet that happens in the middle of this, the one down in the dungeon. Because I swear there are like 3 ballets that are mentioned. There's the butterfly ballet, which is the guys with the butterfly nets. There's the dungeon ballet. And then I want to say, no, I might be wrong here. There's supposed to be, it might be an operetta, but a little song in there about Mrs. Collins massaging Dr. Terwilliker's arm. There's like a whole song written around that, which is wild. His baton arm is crucial.
Well, he's got a scabbard for his baton. I love that. I love that little detail.
Well, this was the last time that Dr. Seuss allowed a live action movie to be made out of his stuff until I think he was already dead by the time The Grinch and The Cat in the Hat came out in 2000 and 2003. And then after that, his estate, it might have been his daughter. I'm not sure who, Audrey Giesel. She's like, yeah, that's it. No more live action. So that's why everything since then has been all animated or computer animated type stuff, like the Lorax and the subsequent like prequels to How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And it's, oh, okay. I guess those were just too much for people. I think that some people really like How the Grinch Stole Christmas. I'm not one of them, but I have yet to, and I'm sure this will get some people to comment on this episode, I have yet to meet anybody that likes the Cat in the Hat movie, except for maybe Mike Myers himself.
I don't know anybody. And I will freely admit I'm completely tainted by the cartoon version of the Grinch. And anytime you got Boris Karloff in, that's it. We're done. Just stop right there.
Oh, and Chuck Jones's animation style plays with Dr. Seuss's style so well.
Really, yeah, it's outstanding.
Yeah. Who was it, John? Because before you showed 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, you showed Gerald McBoing Boing, which I think won an Oscar that in 53 or 52.
Yeah, exactly. That's that UPA cartoon that's based on Seuss. And yeah, that's pretty astounding. That captures the whole Seuss thing, I think, even better than those cartoons that we saw, The Cat in the Hat, those ones that were made, I think, in the 60s or early 70s.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize how crazy popular Gerald McBoing Boing was. He had a whole show that I saw in one of Dr. Seuss's biographies. They reproduced Gerald McBoing Boing meets Mr. Magoo. I was like, really? That's a pretty amazing pairing. He probably doesn't even know that kid is around, and he's just freaking him out with all those sound effects.
Yeah, exactly. He's assigned to babysit, and we showed that actually in the cartoon festival last year at the Redford. It was a hoot. But I love those old UPA cartoons, those ultra modern. Seuss had also collaborated on the Warner Brothers cartoon, one of the Horton, I forget which ones, in the 40s. Plus, he did those Snafu cartoons during the World War II. And boy, we even unearthed at another animation festival some advertising he was doing for the car companies and for oil companies with all sorts of Seuss type creatures in it. So what a career. And this comes out, it appears like when he is, before he's a household name, before he's, I think this is 4 years before Cat in the Hat comes out. So he's just doing all sorts of things. He's in all sorts of types of entertainment back in the early 1950s.
I was watching Jeopardy. It was the Jeopardy Invitational Tournament repeats that they're doing right now. And one of the clues was to complete the line, Quick Henry, the blank. And I was like, oh, the flit. And I only knew about that because Dr. Seuss, in his advertising career, created this. The flit is a pesticide. Yeah, bug killer. And it was like, oh, yeah, that became like a popular catchphrase of the day. So I was like, oh, yeah, it's the flit. And then Ken Jennings, of course, nobody got it. And Ken Jennings was just like, there's a lot of cranky octogenarians right now. And I was like, fuck you, Ken Jennings.
I thought you were going to tell me that there was a Jeopardy question about Dr. T. When that would have blown my mind. Because where does it show up in pop culture? It's in is it in The Simpsons? Simpsons reference everything. Have they gotten around to Dr. T?
I wonder if Bart was named after Bartholomew Collins sometimes. Because, yeah, he's not Cubbins in this. He's Bartholomew Collins. But Bartholomew Collins was a pretty popular Dr. Seuss character. I read one of those in prep for this called, what was it? Bartholomew Collins and it wasn't Ooze, but basically it was Ooze. It's this king who gets tired of it always being rain or snow or sleet that's coming down. So he wants something new to come from the sky. So he hires all of these magicians and he's a king. Of course, he's got magicians in this court, and they create this stuff that was basically green goo that falls from the sky, and it's really super sticky. It's like green glue that comes down, and it won't go away, and it's sinking the whole thing. Bart can't raise the alarm because whenever he goes to somebody and they're supposed to, call out, the goop will get in their mouth and they can't breathe ever again. I'm like, wow, that's really dark. It just goes through all of this where he's trying to save stuff until he finally makes the king say that he's sorry and that he was wrong, and that dissolves the goop right away. Oh, okay. But yeah, Bart Collins, Bart Cubbins right there. And yeah, I don't know if Bart Simpson was named after him or not, but I know that there are definitely, if you go in the connections tab on IMDb, there's tons of, they're watching it in a Pineapple Express or something. I'm like, okay, I didn't know that.
Oh, this film they're watching?
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't seem to show up that much. And it just seems like still a well-kept secret. And that's what makes it, I think, even more special, even among cult films, is how few people still know about this movie. It shows up sometimes, like there's a Monkeys episode where Davy Jones just happens to be randomly wearing one of the Dr. Terwilliker hats with the hands on it. Must have just been a prop hanging around at Columbia at the time when they're making the show. So it shows up sometimes, but I just feel like it's still a secret.
Jeopardy did make a reference to it back in season 33 in the category movie numbers. So there was a 5,000 fingers question.
Wow. I wonder if anybody got it.
We should mention for your adoring viewers that if your interest is piqued by our fascinating discussion, you can find this film in its entirety just on YouTube. And the same goes for Gerald McBoing Boing, which is, I think, 7 or 8 minutes. Just look on YouTube. Everything's there. Fire it up. Check it out.
I can't believe we talked this long without talking about the Do-Me-Do Duds number, which should be more famous than it is because it's just brilliant.
These songs are so catchy. I had the Happy Fingers song stuck in my head all day today. Yesterday I had the Do-Me-Do song, and I'm trying to, then even this morning I was singing the Dungeon song as well. But yeah, Do-Me-Do Duds. And unfortunately, that's one thing that gets taken out of this version that we see too. There's a song where Dr. Terwilliker is singing about his favorite notes. Some people love fa, some people love so and all this, but his favorite note is mi. And so it's this whole mi is my favorite thing. So that plays really well into the Do-Me-Do song too. Holy cow.
Do, re, mi, fa, 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 fa. Some folks think fa is rather sweet. Dear fa, they say, it can't be beat. Yet there are others that I know who much prefer good old do. Still I've heard them say the finest note of all is re. But not for me, I disagree. For me there is one special note. I love it ringing in my throat. Of all the wondrous numerous notes there are. My very favorite note by far. My favorite note. Ha 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 ha. He's not do re. He's not la si. My favorite note is me, me, me. My favorite note is me.
Just to give your listeners a thrill, if you're wondering about the song, it includes lyrics like, "Come and dress me in my peekaboo blouse with the lovely inner lining made of Chesapeake mouse. I want my polka dotted dickie with the crinoline fringe, for I'm going domy-doing on a domy-do binge." Doesn't get any better than that, does it?
When he's there in his, green t-shirt and purple shorts, looks like he's dressed for being the Joker in that color combination. When they put on his lavender spats, which lavender has always been coded as very gay, and this does show up in certain gay movies of the 50s books, but Conreid does this little thing where he's checking himself out in the mirror and he moves his feet around to show himself his spats. And it's just little moments like that where I'm like, oh my God, that is so nice. Just little things. Even when he's having that hypnotism fight with Zabludowski, and you see he's in the background and Zabludowski is there. And I take that back. I'm thinking of the Get Together Weather when Zabludowski is dancing with Heloise Collins, with Mrs. Collins, and Terwilliker's in the back. I cannot take my eyes off of Hans Conreid because he's doing all of these little things with his face where it's just, oh, this is okay. Wait a second. He's dancing too close to her. I need to get in there. And you read all of this stuff on his face. I'm just like, this guy is amazing. I love him.
Yeah, he's terrific. And when he's finally all the way dressed, he is like a nightmare version of Heinrich Himmler meets Liberace. It is a wonderful and appalling at the same time.
I want to talk about Judson and Whitney, the two twins. And we talked a little bit about how this is metaphor for World War II. And these Judson and Whitney characters, they have a whole song to themselves, which unfortunately gets cut out. If you watch the movie knowing that things have been removed, you'll see some occasional weird cuts. Like one of the first times that we see these two guys, to describe these to the audience, it's two middle-aged / older gentlemen who wear these like bowler hats. They're on roller skates and they have one tremendously long beard that goes from Judson to Whitney and Whitney back to Judson, connected by a terrible Siamese beard, as the lyrics to their solo song go, which is, unfortunately, we don't get that song. We get a little piece, very little piece, right before we see them skate side by side down this long hallway. These guys are amazing roller skaters. And there's a little musical motif for them, which is da 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 da. It's yes, we are the guards. And that will play anytime that they show up. And you just get a little slice of that before you see them take off. And it's, oh, that was their whole song. And then, John, you even have a still of Judson and Whitney at these tiny little pianos. And you see these pianos in the movie in front of, I guess it's the corridor to their domain or something. And they had a whole song that they were doing at these little pianos with the long beard in between. And the reason why I keep focusing on this beard is, and I believe, again, David, you brought this up all those years ago when you were writing your piece, that this was a common thing for Seuss to do. He had, we didn't mention that he also did a comic strip called Heji, Heji from 1935. He had two billy goats in there that had a shared beard. But what really got me was his political cartoons. And he has one that is a person in a suit and it says Nazi Germany on it. He's got a long beard, and that's going all the way to another person who has America First, because that was Charles Lindbergh's whole political movement, the America First movement. which oddly, it feels like I've heard that again recently. I'm not sure how that comes about, but this whole thing, he hated Lindbergh and he knew that Lindbergh was a Nazi sympathizer. So this cartoon of America First and Nazi Germany sharing the same beard. And I'm like, I think that's what Judson and Whitney are showing, this alliance type of thing.
The Nazi Party had a big conference or celebration in Carnegie Hall in the 1930s. Many Americans were fully on board with fascism, disturbingly so. And that hasn't changed, quite frankly.
I don't think anybody has ever seen anything like what happened the other night at Madison Square Garden. The love in that room. It was breathtaking, and you could have filled it many, many times with the people that were unable to get in.
Maybe it's just me, but one of the things I like about Judson and Whitney is it throws me back every time I see them to the art and the work of Edward Lear. Just the absurdity of it and the visual of it and the playfulness of it. And it's just so creatively done. And the two brothers that play the twins, they're just magnificent. They are tremendous roller skaters. They've got no lines, but they are, for me, one of the iconic images that appears in this film.
And I love that they're killed by cutting their beard apart. And then you get that great moment of Conreid, the famous Shakespearean actor, Hans Conreid.
Right.
Alas, poor Judson. Alas, poor Whitney.
And even the way they die, the way they spin like a top, stopping.
They're conjoined twins. Cut them apart, they die. Yeah. I love the use of the theremin in this film. I love theremin in general. If you're unfamiliar with the term, it's that creepy sci-fi wailing sound that is there on The Day the Earth Stood Still. It's there in The Lost Weekend and Spellbound. And they make really, or maybe a little bit in the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, although that's technically an electro theremin. It's just used so effectively. And it just creates such a mood all by itself when you hear that sound.
So it's mostly associated with his hypnotizing of Eloise, right? Isn't that kind of almost exclusively used in those scenes?
It announces him a few times. When he walks on screen, you hear the noise of the theremin.
What a great invention. Obviously, you can be appalled by humanity every minute of every day, but once in a while, it's like someone comes up with something like an instrument you don't actually touch. And it's just super cool and wonderful. And it makes you, man, I'm glad I'm a human being. That's an amazing invention.
This movie, she makes me feel that same way. Such a special film. And we got to talk about the dungeon ballet scene, because that's one of the Seussiest things in that all those crazy instruments and the costume. And it's dark and it's surprising. And one thing that I talked to Mike about this, I can never really spot George Chakiris in there, but I know he's one of the dancers, maybe not credited, but it's well known that this is one of the movies where he was doing his time before West Side Story. I had a chance to interview him last year when he came to the Red Shirt with West Side Story. And he has no recollection of anything related to Dr. T. He was like, it was just like our Tuesday. So it was totally unmemorable. But to me, it's such a highlight of the film. I love the way it ends. I love all the different instruments. It's just full of wacky ideas, like 100 wacky ideas in one musical number.
The guy who has to put on the pince-nez in order to read the sheet music and then uses a gun to shoot a target in order to make a note, or the guy who's on the swing, who swings all the way across the screen and the camera has to follow him across. And that's after several other movements of horns and all this. And he swings across and just hits a little gong. And then he does it again. I'm like, oh my, or the guy who's wearing the football helmet with antlers that have bells on them.
And he gets choked.
He gets choked in order to play his instrument is how.
And who knows? Why don't kids love this movie? It's right.
You got those guys with the multicolored gloves that are playing that major marimba that they have. Everything's out of proportion. That huge harp and everything. And I mentioned that huge drum that the guy's in. And I want to talk about the dungeon guy who I mentioned Hedgie, the comic strip, and he's a recycle of a character named Strogo from that. Though Strogo in this is I believe he's the guy with the hearing aid, who's also great. But the guy who runs the elevator looks like this character Strogo, who was able to walk up and down walls, which was neat. But this guy, only black actor in the entire movie, doesn't even get to wear a shirt. He's all greased up and he's built like a brick shit house, which is great. But then he's wearing this crazy hat that it almost looks like he has a triangle for a head, the way that this is. And these eyes sticking out of this mask, or the eyes are the only thing that are exposed. And it is a nightmare. And then to hear him sing this song about all the floors of tortures that Dr. Terwilliker has, it's amazing.
And you taught me something I didn't know, that there's if you listen to the song, there's a missing floor in there, right? So they cut a line, and what was in that line?
In that line, it is a discussion. So each floor has this whole thing of, jewelry department. So we've got ankle chains and wrist chains and these chains and those chains. And yeah, the missing verse talks about household appliances, and there's a gas chamber mention in there. And I'm just like, as if we couldn't layer on this Hitler thing even more, that he's talking about here on the third floor, we have gas chambers.
A movie for kids.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Mr. Bungle does a cover of that in their live shows. I can't find a really good version, or else I would end the episode with Mr. Bungle doing that song. But I was just like, that seems very appropriate. It feels like Mike Patton would probably be a very big fan of this movie.
You talked about the World War II, analogies, but the whole atomic thing, which help me out with this, because it always seems like just thrown in there. It's atomic when they're making their concoction. But how are we supposed to feel about basically an atomic bomb going off to the end of the film? Is it just silliness, or is that saying something?
At that point in American history, the Soviets, thanks to a spy, had copied the Hiroshima bomb, and they had the atomic bomb, and it was a genuine fear. You guys have seen they seem ridiculous to us now, but little kids hiding under their desks, duck and cover. And atomic bomb drills were a very real part of little kids going to school. People were terrified. You got this mushroom cloud of death hanging over your head as the Cold War escalated.
So it shows up just everywhere, even at the end of this movie. I want to talk about how resourceful Bart is with all the contents of his pockets. It's sort of the funniest bits, like how much stuff he's got in his pocket to make his concoction.
He's got Batman's utility belt, everything you could possibly want. And you know what? It's ridiculous, but I love it because it's just the absurdity of a little kid who's going to have all manner of crap and garbage and nonsense in his pockets, and he can pull anything out. And then they mix it up and it starts to smoke. It's ridiculous, but I love the ridiculousness of it.
Yeah, I think this might have worked a little bit better. That earlier draft, the 51 draft, to tie the dream to the real world, what happens is that Zabludowski isn't that great of a plumber, and their boiler blows up. So the explosion of the music fix is tied to the explosion of this boiler. Conveniently, now this is actually way better than the real movie. Conveniently, it destroys the piano. And Zabludowski talks Heloise into not replacing the piano. They go off on the town. Little Bart goes out and does his thing. Terwilliker is defeated because he's not going to take the piano anymore. And that's the one thing about the movie itself now as it stands, and even the uncut version that was released or shown in some of these test screenings. Terwilliker is not defeated. Terwilliker is probably going to be by the next day with his happy fingers. There's Bart, yes, he might have a different stepfather now, but he's still stuck playing the piano.
Oh, Mike, no, Mike, listen. August is going to give Heloise a ride into town. It's over. And Bart, it's like this iconic ending. He's out running down a tree-lined suburban street with his dog and his baseball mitt and his baseball. It is a happy ending. Trust me, August and Heloise will come back, and that's the end of Terwilliker, right?
But what does happen to Terwilliker? He's thwarted with this big premiere, but he's still there, right? He doesn't. It's not like the Wicked Witch.
Those little kids drag him away.
Oh, do they tear him apart?
That's what I'm thinking, is that they just rip him from limb to limb, but I'm not sure who could kill a child all of a sudden in this movie. It's pretty disturbing the way that they carry him off.
I have to ask you guys, and you can straighten me out. Did you guys read, maybe it's just anecdotal, that they had all these kids, whatever, they had 400 kids at the studio, and all the kids stuffed themselves silly on hot dogs at the commissary, and they came back to shoot the scene, and one kid started puking, and that all the other kids started puking as well?
I read that both in Stanley Kramer's autobiography.
All right.
He tells the first part of it where he says that it sounded almost like food trucks, but yeah, commissary probably makes more sense, where they just stuffed themselves full of hot dogs. And then Dr. Seuss himself finishes the story, and I read the quote in one of his biographies, which was, and then these kids started throwing up, and once one kid started throwing up, another, and it turns to that scene from Stand By Me.
I wish they'd filmed that.
Yeah. It sounds like Dr. Seuss himself did not have a good time on this film. And yeah, he was so disappointed, because this is Dr. Seuss. You see Dr. Seuss in every frame of this film.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the magic of it. That's what I loved so much about it the first time I saw it, is I have not seen this in terms of a story, nor have I seen it in terms of set design. And topped off by Hans Conreid's performance. It was just refreshing and different and new and unexpected. And I guess those are qualities that I appreciated about it a great deal.
Yeah, I really take offense to so many reviews and summaries of the film that call it like just a fascinating disaster. I think it really works. And if you look too deep at it, you can see a lot of the cracks. Wow, to me, it works all over the place. And I don't want to make apologies for it. I think it's just a brilliant film as it stands, even with those cuts.
Yeah. Even with the cuts, there's still enough there that you get so much of this. Even without seeing Zabludowski doing more of the hypnotism, you understand that he's hypnotizing the mother. And you get those little looks that he'll do, and she'll straighten up and fly right after he shoots her look. She'll suddenly drop that happiness that she has and just becomes this automaton. I found that the remake of this didn't work nearly as well. I like J.K. Simmons a lot, but I think that changing this from piano to the drums and making that movie Whiplash just didn't work nearly as well.
Yeah, he didn't have the Do-Mi-Do Duds part. I missed it greatly. Oh man, I didn't make that connection. There it is. Yeah, that's it.
Another thing I like about this movie is it doesn't even make any attempt to offer socializing messages for children. Like so many cartoons, especially Disney cartoons. If you watch Snow White, beware strangers, wash your hands before you eat, say your prayers before you go to bed. And that doesn't even bother. It's not trying to socialize kids at all. And that's nice. Let the kids be kids.
Yeah, it wasn't really selling piano lessons very well, was it?
No, it was not.
No, it's quite the opposite. That song that little Bart sings about, hey, we're kids, quit picking on us. Some of the lyrics of that are a little clunky with that. Just because you can grow a beard doesn't mean that you're that cool, kind of. But I appreciate that he's just, hey, man, quit picking on kids. Like, we've got feelings too. Luckily, it's not like, when was the kid power movement? Was that more like 90s, early 2000s, where every cartoon was just like, yeah, kids are doing it for themselves? Get out of here with that noise. I don't need any of that stuff.
Well, like every little kid, I tried, there's Mother's Day, there's Father's Day. I tried to run that past my parents. What about a kid's day?
Every day is kids' day.
Now get back in your dungeon.
That's right.
Now, David, you said you showed this movie to your kids? Because again, I didn't have much of, my kids weren't really into it. Did you show this to your kids?
Yeah, I showed it to my daughter, my poor daughter, who I love so much. She came home one day from school and said, boy, she's in junior high. The kids are talking about this really weird movie they saw. And she said, I was trying to think of if I've ever seen a weird movie. And I said, I got a movie you can watch. You want to watch it? She goes, yeah. So I showed her Eraserhead. She went to school the next day, fully armed. Oh, you guys want to talk about a weird movie? So I don't think I showed her this, but I showed it to my son. He didn't like it as much as he likes the fighty stuff. He liked Alexander Nevsky and
that blows my mind. They were showing kids that. That's crazy great. I took my son at age 13 to a midnight screening at the Main of Eraserhead. And yeah, my kid says that that was a real major moment in growing up. I don't know if that's good or bad, but definitely the movie had an impact in it. That definitely worked. Not so much 5,000 Fingers, but definitely Eraserhead.
The beautiful thing about kids, and I recommend this to any listeners out there, is 2, 3, 4-year-olds. You can show them silent movies. You can show them Charlie Chaplin. You can show them Buster Keaton. They're cartoons and they love them. There's a Chaplin film called 1 a.m. The whole film is just Chaplin coming home drunk and trying to navigate his way through his house. I showed that to my son. He's 4. He was in hysterics because it was so funny. And it's a live action cartoon pretty much.
Yeah. The kids were my kids weaned on Buster Keaton. And a good gateway movie for kids I always found was Singing in the Rain. It's just because that's another live action cartoon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Plus it's got some history in it. But we digress. We're getting off of 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, the greatest movie of the 50s.
I would not be surprised if George Lucas and Steven Spielberg saw this movie, because there's a lot of times you mentioned You're My Only Hope. I was just like, oh, that sounds like a familiar line. There's also, when it comes to Spielberg, there's a lot of Indiana Jones, like Bart popping up in the porthole, like Indy on the boat, or you've got him almost not being able to make it underneath his door. I'm surprised he didn't drop his little beanie hat and grab that.
Oh, yeah,
you know?
that's right.
It feels like there's one other. Oh, I know. It's when Bart is being chased and he goes up and up and up and up that ladder and then jumps off at the end. I was just like, oh, that kind of reminds me of Luke in Bespin when he's running away from Darth Vader and takes that gigantic plunge. But Luke didn't have a fantastically large shirt that he was able to pull out and make a parachute out of it.
But again, I love that. What little kid has not tried to jump off a garage roof with an umbrella?
Oh, yeah.
And float gently to the ground. But just the imagination of it. And this is how a little kid's mind works. And it's there in film and it's magical. Dr. Seuss's ability to tap into the psyche of a little kid remained undiminished. And I find that really admirable. It was billed as the wonder musical of the future, for what it's worth. But I don't think that really captured the essence of what this film was about.
Yeah, they didn't really know how to market this thing, that's for sure. The poster is, I don't know, it's always been on my wall. It's like one of 2 posters, but it doesn't really capture it. They did try to release this again in 1958. It's something called Crazy Music, and I think it did just as dismally in the second release as it did the first. I don't know if they didn't know what to do with it, I don't think.
Yeah, how do you market this?
I mean, now you would have played up the Seuss-ness of it. It would have been like a Dr. Seuss book cover if I was designing the poster for this, but that's, again, looking back on it.
It was the wrong film in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it needed a little bit of stewing, a little bit of marinating before people could appreciate its qualities, its inventiveness, its creativity. I'd love just little stuff like you got to suck down some pickle juice to get your courage up. That's beautiful. It doesn't get any better than that, at least for me, in terms of creativity and not just copying. Because so many films, as you guys know, they're remakes or they're adaptations or we'll just do this again. This stands out on its own as you had never seen anything like this. And I think that's both its strength and its weakness in terms of its popularity.
So I think it's going to be a musical someday, don't you? They're out of ideas so much. They're going to finally turn to Dr. T and make a musical out of it, don't you? Maybe not in our lifetimes, but can you picture this on Broadway?
I'm surprised they haven't. There are so many odd musicals out there. As I'm doing research for this show, it's like, and they turned it into a musical. I'm like, what? Like, oh yeah, Forbidden Planet, Return to Forbidden Planet, the jukebox musical that premiered in England in the 1980s or whatever. Like, What are you talking about? That can't be a musical of Carrie. Get out of here. Nope. Sure is.
Yeah, there's going to be a musical Breaking Bad.
Mhm.
And speaking as someone that works in theater, I'm kind of fed up with musicals. I like plays that tell stories and have characters.
I will recommend recommended the Indicator disc. Yes, you can find this on YouTube, and yes, you can even find it at archive.org. But I'll say that the soundtrack, there's a 3-disc soundtrack out there for this from Film Score Monthly. It is amazing because it is all of the incidental music plus the songs that we've talked about through this whole thing, all the songs that we're familiar with. Plus, it's all of these songs that were cut out. And not only do they have the whole movie basically start to finish, but then on the 3rd disc of this, they have what they call musical or composer sketches. So it's all, what was the name of the gentleman that did this? Frederick Hollander. It was all his early versions of this, and they seem so completely thought out. And when you get to things like even the Happy Fingers song, it is so different, but it's a complete song. And it's amazing to hear where his mind was going with this stuff. And we should probably say too, Frederick Hollander, very well-respected composer. And most people, I think, would know that he wrote Falling in Love Again, the song that was made famous by Marlene Dietrich, the song from The Blue Angel.
So these songs were recorded, but there was visuals to go with them. They had actually filmed the sequences, but those have been lost to time. But we still have the music, eh?
We still have the music, and yeah, that's unfortunately, as far as I know, no one has ever turned up the actual footage of these songs. And yeah, it sounds like they are lost to time, which is very unfortunate because everything is there. I love the person that went out and they have on YouTube the Dungeon song, and it's all live action, and they just stick in a still of that nightmarish elevator operator, and they play the 3rd verse of it, and then they go back into the video and let the song finish out. I'm like, thank you for doing that. I wish that they could do that for this whole movie, do that A Star Is Born, the Judy Garland version where it's all the still images, or our friend Roger Ryan from Livonia, I believe, and what he did with Magnificent Ambersons, where it's like, here's a still image, here's what's going on, here's some of the music that you might have heard, maybe we have the dialogue from the script and we'll act that out. I was like, that's great. And I wish they would do something like that for this until we can get that footage, if that will ever turn up.
Basement dungeon.
I want to thank my co-hosts, David and John, for joining me to discuss this fantastic movie. Until we speak again, gentlemen, David, what have you been up to, sir?
I am currently educating the masses at Wayne State University in Detroit. I've got plays being produced in Golden, Colorado, Wiesbaden, Germany, and Dover, Delaware later this year.
And John, how about yourself?
Well, I can't compete with that. I'm working a lot with the Redford Theater because you come to so many of our screenings. Thank you so much. And we show these. I'm most excited about the little film program that we started next to the Redford in the little storefront. We're in a 50-seat theater. We show 16 millimeter prints of some pretty oddball stuff, including Dr. T. I'm also teaching again at College for Creative Studies. I teach a class in the history of animation. So after 30 years of teaching high school English, they dragged me back in, and I'm going to start teaching that class again next week at CCS.
Yeah, we should probably say that the fall schedule is up at motorcitycinema.org. Some real good stuff coming up. I'm hoping to make it to at least as many as I possibly can, but things like Back to School, I Know Where I'm Going, Bucket of Blood, Coal Miner's Daughter. This is a super incredibly eclectic mix of films, and I am there for it. Stuff that we've covered on the show, like Scarecrow, and then just so many good movies. And I'm super excited for all of the October stuff with so many good horror films.
Yeah, Evil Dead, which of course premiered at the Redford. We're excited to bring that back. But you already did an episode on Scarecrow before you did 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T?
I know. It's weird, right?
Hey, congratulations on your anniversary, too. 600 episodes, right?
700, baby.
I'm sorry. I shortchanged you.
It's okay.
Keep it up. You're doing great. And thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
Oh, we are the guards who are terribly, terribly fair. Two terrible twins with a terrible Siamese beard. Oh, we are a thing. We're a thing you could not call a friend. One Siamese beard with a twin on each end. We're vicious and mean. We're unkind and unkempt and uncool. We have been that way since the earliest youth. Each year we get worse, for that is the unfortunate trend. Siamese beards with a twin on each end. Oh, we are the guards of Terwilliker's land. We're here to make sure that the boys will not get out of hand. Don't try to get fresh in the land we defend. Oh, you will get choked by the beard of the twins with the Siamese beard with a terrible twin on each end.
Dress me in my finest array. 'Cause just in case you haven't heard, today's Do-me-do day. Dress me in my silver garters, dress me in my diamond studs. 'Cause I'm going do-me-doing in my do-me-do duds. I want my undulating undies with the marabou frills. I want my beautiful bolero with the porcupine quills. I want my purple nylon girdle with the orange blossom buds. 'Cause I'm going do-me-doing in my do-me-do duds. on and dress me in my peekaboo blouse with the lovely interlining made of Chesapeake mouse. I want my polka dotted dickie with the crinoline fringe, for I'm going do-me-doing on a do-me-do binge. I want my lavender spats, and in addition to them, I want my honey-colored gusset with the herringbone hem. I want my softest little jacket made of watermelon suede, and my long persimmon placket with the platinum braid. I want my leg of mutton sleeves, and in addition to those, I want my cutie chamois booties with the leopard skin bows. I want my pink brocaded bodice with the fluffy fuzzy ruffs, and my gorgeous bright blue bloomers with the monkey feather cuffs. I want my organdy snood, and in addition to that, I want my chiffon Mother Hubbard lined with Hudson Bay rat. Dress me up from top to bottom, dress me up from tip to toe, dress me up in silk and spinach, for today is do-me-do, do-me-do day, do-me-do day. So come and dress me in the blossoms of a million pink trees. Come on and dress me up in liverwurst and camembert cheese. Come on and dress me up in pretzels. Dress me up in bock beer suds. 'Cause he's going